Once upon a time, there lived a tiny boy no bigger than his father's thumb. During his life, he had many extraordinary adventures. He rode upon butterflies, dined with King Arthur, outwitted giants, and became one of England's most beloved fairy tales. But what if there was more to his story than just make-believe?
For centuries, Tom Thumb has been nothing more than a magical fairy tale, a child born that was no taller than his father's thumb. But what if I told you that here in Lincolnshire, some believe the story of Tom Thumb holds a little grain of truth?
Once upon a time, there lived a humble ploughman and his wife who longed for nothing more than a child. In her heart, she wished that somehow she might have a son, even if he were no bigger than his father's thumb. Such an unusual wish caught the attention of powers far beyond the mortal world. Before long, the Queen of the Fairies and the great wizard Merlin had answered her plea, and so was born a tiny boy named Tom Thumb. Though scarcely taller than a thumb, Tom's adventures were anything but small. He travelled to the court of King Arthur, where his wit and mischievous nature delighted the king and queen alike. Yet his extraordinary life was filled with danger too, for at one point he was swallowed whole by a giant fish, only to be discovered alive when the catch was prepared for the king's table. Knighted for his loyalty and remembered in one of England's oldest fairy tales, Tom Thumb's story has enchanted readers for more than 4 centuries. But what if this wasn't simply a fairy tale? What if, here in Lincolnshire, there is something that has persuaded generations of local people that perhaps, just perhaps, Tom Thumb really did exist?
Hello friends and welcome back to the channel. If you are new here, my name's Claire and this is the Wanderlust Way. Each week I like to try and bring you a new video where I'm in a different location uncovering some of the more unusual stories from Britain and beyond. So today we are in Lincolnshire to uncover the story of Tom Thumb. Now, Tom Thumb was one of my favourite childhood stories, fairy tale stories, along with Thumbelina as well. That was another good one. But I recently uncovered that Tom Thumb does in fact have a grave that's in this church. So that's what this adventure is going to be about. We're going to go and visit the grave. We're going to visit one more site in Lincolnshire that's supposed to be associated with Tom Thumb. And we're going to try and make some sense of all this. So if you're ready for that kind of adventure, thanks to everybody that supports the channel by liking, watching, commenting, subscribing, becoming members, sending super thanks and sending donations, because you guys are helping the car keep topped up so that we can keep this channel running. Okay, so without further ado, enough waffle, let's wander. If, like me, you find yourself in the town of Horncastle, which is the gateway to the Lincolnshire Wolds, and you find yourself outside Bell's estate agents, well, you will also find that there is a very curious looking thing on top of the roof, and it is said to be the house of Tom Thumb.
If you're no stranger to this channel, you may recognise Horncastle. We were here not so long ago following in the footsteps of Victorian executioner William Marwood. But this is one of those towns that holds more than one story. Sitting on the edge of the Lincolnshire Wolds, Horncastle is a historic market town with a remarkable past. The Romans knew it as Banovelum, and if you know where to look, you can still find sections of the ancient Roman walls standing today. For centuries, it became famous for its enormous August horse fair, which grew into the largest in Europe, attracting buyers and traders from across the world. These days, it's perhaps famous locally for being one of the best places in the area to find historic treasure, and by that I mean there are countless antique shops, independent cafes and quirky businesses that all make for a wonderful day out for the history fans amongst us. But history is only half of what makes Lincolnshire so fascinating. This county has always had an extraordinary tradition of folklore. Its lonely fens, rolling wolds and isolated villages have inspired tales that have been passed down for generations. Together on this channel, we have searched for the mysterious Tiddymun, ventured into the fens to learn about the terrifying Langrick werewolf, uncovered ghost stories, forgotten legends, and curious pieces of local history that many people outside of the county have never even heard of. But today's story sits in a top-tier level of famous folklore oddities. The legend of Tom Thumb and the stories surrounding him have travelled the globe. And perched high above the frontage of Bell's estate agents is something that brings that legend to life. I imagine thousands of people walk past this building without ever noticing. A tiny house, carved from stone, for which local tradition says was once the home of England's most famous little man, Tom Thumb. At first glance, it feels like nothing more than a charming curiosity, a quirky decoration that's become part of the town's character. But as I discovered, that little house opens the door to a mystery involving folklore, forgotten history, and a tiny grave. And what exactly it all means is just what we're going to find out.
Welcome to Tattershall, which is in the Lincolnshire Fens and around 22 miles away from Lincoln City. Now, this is a beautiful part of the world. You've got, in this place in particular, is lots of history. I think we covered this area a little bit when we did the historic airfields. This was Bomber County, but not today. There is a church and there is an amazing castle, which we are going to have a little look at. But this is meant to be the home, possibly, of Tom Thumb of Tattershall.
Like Horncastle, Tattershall has roots stretching back to Roman times. Today it's a peaceful Lincolnshire village, but its history reaches back centuries, and over the years it's found itself woven into some remarkable chapters of England's story. Towering over the village is Tattershall Castle. The first castle on this site was built in 1231 by Robert de Tattershall, but the magnificent red brick tower that dominates the skyline today was built in the 15th century by Ralph Cromwell, Lord Treasurer to King Henry VI. It's now cared for by the National Trust and is widely regarded as one of the finest surviving examples of medieval brick architecture in England. For history lovers, Tattershall Castle is remembered for more than just its impressive architecture. In 1453, it played host to the marriage of Sir Thomas Neville and Maud Stanhope. On the surface, this was a wedding between two noble families, but politically, it was far more significant than that. The marriage united two powerful families, angered their rivals in the Percy family, and helped fuel a bitter feud that would become part of the wider conflict we now know as the Wars of the Roses. But that's a story for another day, perhaps. But it just goes to show that Tattershall has well and truly earned its place in the history books.
We have just had the delight of meeting Nick, who owns the Wayside Cafe, which is behind me. Now, he's told me a little bit of history about Tattershall, which was absolutely fascinating. We got onto the subject of Tom Thumb, and he said, "Oh, well, haven't you realised we've got a Tom Thumb house here as well?" So, have a look here. So that was Nick's cafe. He's giving me a little postcard about it. And then look behind you. There's another one of those little houses. Was this a thing then? Are there other villages and towns in Britain with Tom Thumb houses? If you know about any, please do let me know in the comments.
I have to be honest, I was genuinely blown away by this. I'd never even heard of these tiny Tom Thumb houses until very recently, and now in the space of, a couple of days, I've seen two of them. Nick explained that this little house in Tattershall didn't always stand here, that it originally sat on the roof of a building just across the road before being moved to its current home. Exactly why it was moved or when, I'm not entirely sure, but it's a remarkable addition to our story. So once again, a huge thank you to Nick at the Wayside Cafe, not only just for showing us around and sharing its history, but for the extra hints and tips he gave about these Tom Thumb houses. And to be honest, the place, his cafe, it had won me over with the golden skeleton hanging by the sign outside, and everything else inside that, well, that was just a bonus. So if you do find yourself in Tattershall, I definitely recommend popping in. It's full of history and character. We were made to feel incredibly welcome. But for now, I'm going to leave these curious little houses alone. Later in the video, we will come back to them and try and work out exactly what they are and whether they really have anything to do with the legend of Tom Thumb. But first, it's time to visit the place that started this whole adventure, a tiny grave with an extraordinary story.
Holy Trinity Church now stands in the shadow of Tattershall Castle. I believe you can only come to visit this church. I believe it's only open when the castle is open. However, this is where part of our story takes place, because inside this church is said to be the grave of Tom Thumb.
Holy Trinity Church was built between 1465 and 1485 on the wishes of Ralph Cromwell, you know, the guy from Tattershall Castle. It was constructed from Ancaster stone, and it's considered one of the finest examples of perpendicular architecture in England and has remained remarkably unchanged for more than 500 years. It was built as the final resting place for the Cromwell family, with a college of priests charged with praying for the souls of Lord Cromwell, King Henry VI, and their loved ones. Step inside today and it's hard to imagine just how colourful this place once was. Now, originally every window was filled with magnificent stained glass, but much of it disappeared during the 18th century. Local tradition tells of villagers preparing to stop it being removed, only for the glass to be taken away under the cover of darkness before they had the chance. Now, these days the church has become just as famous for its wildlife, providing a home to one of Lincolnshire's most important bat colonies. There are 7 different species living amongst its ancient timbers. But it wasn't the architecture, the stained glass, or even the bats that brought me here. Somewhere inside this church is that tiny grave that we've come to see. Here lies the grave of T. Thumb. Now, according to local legend, the Tom Thumb of Tattershall stood just over 18 inches tall and lived to the remarkable age of 101, dying in 1620. And yet, for all the stories that surround him, this is where the evidence begins, and, rather frustratingly, where it almost ends. Over the centuries, fact and folklore have become so tightly woven together that countless versions of Tom Thumb have emerged, each adding another layer to the mystery. The grave itself is surprisingly modest, a small, unassuming stone set into the church floor, simply inscribed T. Thumb, aged 101, died 1620. Beside it rests a poem and a handful of flowers, quiet reminders that whether visitors come here believing in the legend or simply curious about it, the story of Tom Thumb is still very much alive in Tattershall.
So I've got so many questions now about this. Is this grave real? Is it just that somebody's etched onto a flagstone Tom Thumb as a bit of a joke? Was there a person under that, in that tiny little space? I mean...
So, what do I make of all of this? Well, I'd like to think that a church wouldn't knowingly claim to have somebody buried there if they weren't. If this grave had been placed by the roadside or inside a tourist attraction, I'd probably dismiss it as nothing more than a bit of fun. But inside a church, well, somehow it carries a little more weight. At least I'd like to think so. What about you? The trouble is, rumour has it that there was another Tom Thumb buried in Lincoln Cathedral, so that does sort of change the way I'm going to look at this. The truth is, we'll probably never know for certain whether the Tom Thumb buried here was a real man or simply part of a legend, or whether there's anybody here at all. Maybe it's just an inscription. I don't know for sure, but we can look at the evidence. The first thing that struck me was the date. According to the grave, T. Thumb died in 1620. The earliest surviving printed version of the History of Tom Thumb was published in 1621, just 1 year later. If the grave is genuine, that's an astonishing coincidence. But the story doesn't start there. Even before that famous booklet appeared, Tom Thumb was already being mentioned in English writings during the late 16th century. That tells us he was already a well-known folk character before anyone committed his adventures to paper. Those adventures, however, don't really fit with our Lincolnshire grave. In the earliest versions of the tale, Tom wasn't entertaining King Henry VIII or Queen Elizabeth I. He was a tiny dwarf of King Arthur's court, embarking on impossible adventures, being swallowed by cows, fish, giants, before somehow escaping to tell the tale. As the centuries passed, the story evolved again and again until Victorian children were reading their own versions, and the name became so famous that P.T. Barnum even borrowed it for his performer, General Tom Thumb. Somewhere along the way, the lines between folklore, fairy tale and local tradition became almost impossible to separate. Then there are the little houses. They certainly add to the mystery, but despite their popular nickname, they weren't built for Tom Thumb at all. They're actually medieval ceramic roof louvres, designed to ventilate great halls while keeping the rain out. Fascinating pieces of medieval craftsmanship, but almost certainly unrelated to the legend. So where does that leave us? I think it's certainly possible there was once a remarkably small man living in or around Tattershall whose memory became woven into local folklore. Whether he really reached the age of 101 in those times, whether his grave really is here, and whether he's inspired England's oldest fairy tale, I'm not convinced we'll ever be able to prove it either way. And perhaps in the end it doesn't really matter. Because whether Tom Thumb was a real man, a legend, or something in between, nothing can take away the magic he has given to generations of children. For centuries, his adventures have been passed from one generation to the next, reminding us that the impossible might just be possible, that you could ride on the back of a butterfly, visit the court of King Arthur, survive being baked inside a pudding, and somehow live to tell the tale. Tom Thumb has always been one of my favourite stories, whatever the truth may be, and if his adventures ever made you smile or fired your imagination too, then think back to your favourite part of the story, and just for a second, imagine it really happened. Because when we're children, we don't spend our time asking whether something is possible. We simply lose ourselves in the adventure. I sometimes wonder if, as adults, we lose a little too much of that. We become so focused on facts and proving everything beyond doubt that we forget how important it is to wonder. And maybe that's the real gift of stories like Tom Thumb. Not that they convince us magic exists, but that they remind us to stay curious, to keep exploring, to ask questions, to look a little closer at the world around us, and every now and then to allow ourselves to believe that life might still have a few mysteries left to uncover. Because whether it's Tom Thumb, King Arthur, ghosts, folklore, or forgotten history, every great adventure begins with two simple words: what if? So that is it. Thank you to everybody for joining me on this folklore adventure where we've tried to uncover what exactly is going on in Tattershall in Lincolnshire. If you've got any theories about this, if you've got anything that I've missed and you want to include, please do let me know in the comments. And if there are any other stories in the country that you think might be worth exploring for the channel, then do please let me know about those too. Okay, so until next week, stay safe, stay curious, and keep wanderlusting.